Let's face it, this is the 9/11 of the early Stuart period. If you take out the king, his heir, all the leading councillors, all the MPs, and probably 2/3 of the nobility, this is 9/11 writ large.
I think we would have just seen, an absolute catastrophe, really, for the English Roman Catholic community.
We've got a whole different political dynamic, and we could have had a Stuart monarchy that was an absolute monarchy all the way through to the time of Louis XIV, right, in the same sense.
I mean, the great what-ifs of history, and you always imagine, that something as audacious as the Gunpowder Plot would have had a very carefully worked out plan as what might come next. But I think it's absolutely true, there wasn't one.
So we're almost saying that the nation of 1689 appears earlier, and you get a Protestant monarchy, probably more absolute than you would want, and if there is any opposition, it is to that absolute monarchy.
It's the night of the 4th of November 1605, London, and in the cold, dark hours, a discovery has been made that will change the future of the British Isles. 36 barrels of gunpowder hidden beneath the Palace of Westminster as those above ground prepare for the opening of Parliament the following day. One man was caught with those barrels. Guy Fawkes' name has become the stuff of legend, yet he was part of a group of conspirators, Catholic rebels, with a goal to assassinate King James I and almost the entire English establishment. Of course, the plot failed, all involved were caught, and the monarchy endured. Yet, what if the plan had been carried out to its gruesome conclusion? And remember, the 5th of November took on a very different meaning indeed. I'm Darryl Morris. This is Times Radio History, and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest moments can shape our world. Every episode we focus on a different military campaign or a tide of history, and with the help of our experts, we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's the Gunpowder Plot, a foiled assassination attempt that could have changed the entire future of Britain. So much that its failure is still celebrated, of course, 420 years later. So, where could we be today had Robert Catesby, Guy Fawkes, and their gang succeeded that day? There are questions for our experts. Joining us today, as ever, the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. And for the first time on the channel, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Anna Whitelock, the historian and the author of The Sun Rising, James I and the Dawn of a Global Britain. Welcome to you both. Thank you both for being with us. I am really looking forward to getting stuck in. Let's start then with where England and Scotland are at this point in 1605. Anna, let's start with you. You've written a lot about this in your book on James I. He is, of course, James I of England, but also James of Scotland.
Absolutely. I mean, if we go back a couple of years to 1603 and the death of the long-reigning Elizabeth I, and she dies without an heir, not having married, and not having officially named an heir. So for a time, there is a real sense of foreboding crisis. England is essentially in lockdown. There's been plague. There's a sense that there could be civil war without a clear successor. But there has been planning behind the scenes, not least from Elizabeth's key counsellor, Robert Cecil, who has been secretly negotiating with James VI in Scotland for some time and promising him that the throne will be his. He needed to just bide his time. And so despite England holding its breath at the end of Elizabeth's reign, fearing invasion and civil war, in fact, the succession was peaceful, and James was acknowledged in London as King of England. Pretty remarkable, of course. England and Scotland had long been enemies, but here, for the first time, was a Scottish king to take the English throne. And he began his journey from Edinburgh down to London, followed later by his wife, his eldest son and daughter, and comes to London with all kinds of hope attached to him. he'd promised all things to all people in the months and years before. He'd raised the hopes of Catholics and Protestants alike. Protestants, that they would see more Protestantism established in England. Catholics, that the clock would be turned back and Catholicism restored. So he promised much, and in the early months and years, he disappointed those particular groups, and that, in a way, lay the seeds for the Gunpowder Plot.
Yeah, really interesting. And actually, the fact that there was a sort of relatively peaceful transition of power in itself feels quite extraordinary, doesn't it, in the context? Chris, just give us your perspective of that sort of moment of history, the build-up to his reign and the significance of how it happened and what he promised.
Well, I think, as Anna said, what's important here is the triumph of the deep state. You've got the establishment, the Protestant establishment in England saying, look, we need a Protestant monarch to come in and take over. The last thing we want is a Catholic in some form coming in. There are some other people who are actually in the frame here. James VI's cousin, Arbella Stuart, actually has a claim, almost equal claim to the throne, descended from Henry VII, as James himself is. And there is a sort of plot on the way down. There's James is coming south. It's called the By Plot. And there is a plot there by, in fact, some Catholic priests and a Puritan nobleman to try and actually displace him. Also, there's a thing called the Main Plot that occurs, and that's a plot whereby essentially Sir Walter Raleigh is involved, and some noblemen actually get in touch with Philip III of Spain and say, give us some money and we'll actually provoke quite a lot of rebellion here. And essentially the Spanish hand over £22 million in today's terms, and that is going to be divided. That never comes to anything. The By Plot and the Main Plot are sort of discovered very early, and the conspirators are dealt with. Of course, Walter Raleigh gets a sort of post-dated execution to 1618 out of that. But in fact, you can see there is some sort of resistance to James taking over. And one of the features of the Gunpowder Plot, which is never really brought to light, is there is a pronounced anti-Scottish element to it. Everybody talks about the fact that it's Catholics, but Guy Fawkes, when he's interrogated, and they say, well, why were you going to do it? He actually says, because I wanted to blow you Scots back to your barren mountains.
Right, wow.
And that theme is underplayed pretty much until the modern era. So there is some resistance to James taking over and the sort of courtiers that he's going to introduce into the establishment. And we shouldn't underestimate how unpopular Robert Cecil is.
Okay.
And when he eventually goes, there's quite a lot of rejoicing. So it's not entirely stable, and there is some sort of undercurrent of resistance.
And it's interesting to consider how some of those characters sort of rear their head in the other version of history that we're going to come to in a bit, where we sort of figure out what may have happened had the assassination attempt worked. Anna, help set the scene for how the assassination attempt came about, though, in the first place, because, as you mentioned, James making lots of promises to Catholics that they felt eventually let down on.
Yeah, they felt let down. I mean, on his way south, he'd been presented by the Protestants, the Puritans, with what's known as the millenary petition, which called for lots of Protestant changes. And at the same time, he was petitioned by Catholics for further change. So there was great hope. There was also great hope in what might happen in negotiations with Spain. England, of course, was at war with Spain, had been right back through to the Spanish Armada. So there was a sense that perhaps Philip of Spain would force more Catholic concessions in the peace. But all of that came essentially to nothing. And so a band of young men from the Midlands, disaffected young men, ultimately what we might sort of describe as modern day kind of suicide terrorists, or were absolutely determined to take radical action. And so over days and months came together to plot this most audacious, ambitious plot, which would see not just the king in Parliament assassinated, and very likely his eldest son and heir, Prince Henry, but the whole ruling establishment. And it's, that the audacity of the plot is quite remarkable, given particularly that we're talking about essentially a plot led by Robert Catesby, a Northamptonshire gentleman, and a number of other young Catholic gentlemen from the Midlands, sort of 7 main ones in total, and then they drew in a range of other ones. And the plan, of course, was that the conspirators would tunnel into the basement of the House of Lords from a building that was rented next door, and then the cellar beneath the House of Lords in the Palace of Westminster actually fortuitously came up for rent, and so they took the lease there, and so then the gunpowder could be stored there rather than have to be brought in later. And so the gunpowder sat there waiting to be ignited at the key moment. And of course, so there was a plot centred in London, but also there was the follow-up, which was an intended uprising, particularly in the Midlands, led by Catholic gentlemen. And that would be the key second part of the plot. They would kidnap the 9-year-old Princess Elizabeth. She was at Combe Abbey, being looked after there, and they would place her on the throne. So that we have to keep our eyes on the Midlands, and we have to keep our eyes on the Palace of Westminster in London.
Okay, we'll come back to some of the details of how that play out in a moment. It's a really important point, isn't it? Because this, of course, goes beyond London. Let's consider our map, Chris Parry. Just give us a bit of a sense of what the sort of key points of the West Midlands, and also actually sort of a bit further north in Scotland, looks like at this moment.
So, I mean, the border between England and Scotland looks very much the same as it does today, but of course that's breaking down. And the border ravers, of course, the ones who've been raiding across the border for the best part of 3 centuries, are suddenly out of business. So all these families that have had sort of organised crime networks are going to be sort of not having a future. What I think is important to remember about these conspirators is they're known to the authorities. We see that a lot in the modern era. They would be on watch lists. So people are watching what they're doing. In fact, 4 or 5 of these were arrested when Elizabeth was ill in the 1590s. They said, we can't afford to have these people out there. They're actually quite dangerous. What's also significant about them is that a lot of them have fought in the Spanish Netherlands on behalf of Spain. So the Wright brothers, for example, are known swordsmen. So they're all very accomplished personal sort of fighters who've got military experience on the continent, on the wrong side, of course, from the British point of view. They are Catholics, and there's an extensive Catholic network that extends into the West Midlands. That's the key point. They also think that if they're going to have a rebellion, they're going to get support from Wales. That occurs quite a lot. That's why they want to be up in that region. More importantly, most of them are related by marriage or indeed blood relatives as well. It's quite significant. This is a very tight group. And as Anna said, they bring in other people when they need additional financing and when they need some sort of tactical experience. So they bring in a guy called Sir Everard Digby. He's a landowner. He's married well. He's got an estate in Buckinghamshire. He's a late convert. And what's interesting here in the modern era, of course, it's the converts that are actually quite fanatical. Now, Digby's brought in because he's, again, a swordsman. He's known for being militarily quite good. He's got a stable of very strong horses, and he's got the finance as well. And just when they're running out of money, they bring in this guy. And at this point, they start discussing, well, what are we doing with the wives while this is going on? There's actually a discussion. Where are we going to park our wives? Because we don't want them in the way. And they talk about all of this sort of thing. But it all depends sequentially on the Gunpowder Plot happening. And let's face it, this is the 9/11 of the early Stuart period. If you take out the king, his heir, all the leading councillors, all the MPs, and probably 2/3 of the nobility, this is 9/11 writ large. And, it's going to be anarchy afterwards. And they relied very much on being able to get up, if you like, the M40, as it would have been today, to get into the West Midlands, to raise rebellion where they think they've got sympathy. They've got a whole network of Catholics and their families there. They're also in touch with Jesuit priests as well, all of whom have said, don't go there. We really don't need this right now because there'll be more and more oppression. And certainly one of Catesby actually reveals in the confession to one of these Jesuits, he actually says, and then, of course, the Jesuit can't reveal what's in the confession. And so there's all sorts of things. One final point, I think, Darryl, to mention here is an extensive counter-terrorist and counter-intelligence network that's been inherited from Robert Cecil's father, Lord Burleigh, and Walsingham. Throughout Elizabeth's reign, it's been a constant constant demand on government to suppress, detect, deter the Catholic terrorist threat. And what they're really keen to do, particularly under James, is ensure the loyalty of the broad Catholic population whilst isolating that terrorist and sort of violent minority, the political version, if you like, of Catholicism.
That's really interesting. So before we undo this version of history and consider what would have happened if the plot had succeeded, because it didn't, Anna, James I was able to endure, and you talk about global Britain. You talk James I and global Britain. How do we understand global Britain to have been influenced by James I?
Well, of course, Britain itself is being forged during this period. James had a very clear ambition to not just personally unite England and Scotland, but actually politically unite them. He wanted to create common currency, common laws, and so on. And there was resistance in Parliament, a real sense that this was too far. And, as we've spoken about, there was, historic hostility to the Scots. There was fears that they were going to sort of come down and take English jobs and so on. And so the ultimate full union wasn't achieved. However, there was a sense, not least from James, of Britain being forged in this period. And it was forged in many ways in relations abroad, particularly relations between Protestants in England and Protestants on the continent who were being persecuted. And there was a sort of sense of Britain, this enlarged union of England and Scotland, should be the great protector of Protestants. But of course, so too we see James writing in letters to princes abroad whose territories are being explored for trade, writing as King of Great Britain. So we have this image of Britain and James as King of Great Britain being exported abroad. And even after the failure of the Gunpowder Plot, James is a great writer and intellectual, and there is this sort of whole propaganda debate, war really, a paper war if you like, in Europe, debating the powers of a king over the papacy and whether the Pope can depose secular rulers or what the limits of papal power are. And this is all really kicked off by the Gunpowder Plot. So we're going to explore the counter narrative. But as it was, the narrative that the authorities constructed was really important and disseminated both at home and abroad to reaffirm James's position, but also use it as the basis of his broader claims about the limits of papal authority.
Okay.
I think there's something that's worth mentioning here. There's a thing called the bloody question. And it's basically something that's brought up to say to Catholics living in Britain, more broadly, who's your loyalty to? Is it to some external jurisdiction, the Pope, or is it to the King? And this persists right through the Gunpowder period. And one of the things that Robert Cecil's trying to get in is a thing called an oath of allegiance. He's absolutely desperate for everybody in Britain to have this oath of allegiance to James as the new monarch. And this plays out and bears on the Gunpowder Plot, how it's reported and how it's actually projected in propaganda afterwards. And I think just adding to what Anna said, of course, one of the things that we've inherited from James is the Union flag. He actually produces the first Union flag without, obviously, initially the Cross of St. Patrick, which comes later. But that Union flag persists from James's reign.
No, I was just going to say it's Union Jack.
Yeah.
So that's exactly Jacob's being Latin for James. So it was the Union Jack.
So that's where that comes from.
As a naval officer, I'm going to say it's only a Union Jack when it's on the sea from the jackstaff of a British warship.
There you go. That's a very important point.
There we go.
Okay, let's zoom in now and focus on the plot itself and some of the conspirators. Okay, let's talk about the conspirators and the plot itself, the real version of history. We have here the map of Parliament as was, so we're going to trace our way through it and figure out what really happened. Anna, take us through the conventional narrative. What happened in those fateful weeks?
So, in a nutshell, the story really starts on Saturday, the 26th of October, when an anonymous letter was sent to William Parker, Lord Monteagle, warning him that when Parliament met on the 5th of November, that they should stay away because, as the letter said, those who attended would receive a terrible blow. Monteagle passed the letter to Robert Cecil, who passed it to the king, and a search was conducted at the Palace of Westminster. But they waited. They didn't do the search until the evening of the 4th. So essentially, they wanted to catch the conspirators in the act. So they didn't want to move too quickly. And so on the evening of the 4th, so the day before, the evening before Parliament was to meet, they did a security check, a search, and they found Guy Fawkes in the cellar with 36 barrels of gunpowder. And he was promptly arrested, taken to the Tower to be interrogated. And as the king made clear, if torture was necessary, then so be it. And so we get to the point then the following morning when the plotters hear of Guy Fawkes' arrest. And at that point, they fled northwards, which we might pick up in a moment.
Yeah, okay. Yes, okay, so much to unpick. And actually, Chris, you've sort of got you've got a different take on this moment of history from the sort of narrative we know and are familiar with.
With the sources that we've got, Anna's narrative is perfectly correct. There's no question about that. And that is the conventional wisdom. You know, from a military point of view, an intelligence point of view, I've got a few problems with this. Now, William Parker is, in fact, related by marriage to one of the conspirators. So everybody thinks that Francis Tresham is the man that has written this, or one of the wives has written the letter. I've got another take. I think Lord Monteagle himself is actually part of the conspiracy.
Wow.
It's all done
That's
very
a conspiracy about the conspiracy.
Yeah, so when he receives this anonymous letter, he very theatrically has it read out. Now, if you and I received a letter, you wouldn't actually have it read out in front of all your dinner guests in case it had something indiscreet in it. So that's a bit fishy. When the letter arrives with Cecil, 5 other privy councillors are there at the same time for no reason other than the fact they're going to read the letter. So it looks like a staged thing. So it may well have been Monteagle himself who wrote the letter. And certainly if you look at the calligraphy, it looks like somebody's tried to disguise their handwriting. It's very clumsy, it's not normal or anything like that. My second question is, Thomas Percy, who's a member of the King's bodyguard, is the one who has leased this chamber here, which is not actually a cellar, it's actually a ground floor building underneath the House of Lords, which is on the first floor. And so there's been a myth that the gunpowder somehow got wet. There had been flooding, but that building itself probably wasn't flooded. Now, so another question, where would you get 36 barrels of gunpowder from in London in those days without actually being noticed? We know it came by river, it was unloaded probably at Parliament Stairs, but come on, there's lots of people guarding this. This is a royal palace here in Westminster at the time. So there's all sorts of things that don't hang together here. And as Anna said, 26th of October to the 4th of November, nothing happens. So what is going on in that space? Are they trying to find out who the conspirators are? Cecil himself says, when he hears about the plot from Monteagle, he said, yeah, I thought something was going on. And I'm wondering if they let this play out so they can actually maximise the impact on James himself. Again, presenting it to James, they're very clever because they let James come to the conclusion that the blow means it's a gunpowder issue. Now, what we have to remember is that James's father, although he was strangled, had actually been blown up in Kirkerfield, the husband of Mary Queen of Scots. So for a king that has spent most of his life avoiding assassination, And there have been up to a dozen assassination attempts on James at this time. He's very susceptible to that sort of suggestion. Right. So they lead him down that route. And then you've got this theatrical. In fact, they've been into the Undercroft before. They found somebody they thought was called James Johnson. And he said, I'm only looking after these barrels, which have presumably got wine in them or something like that. Then they say, hang on, there's an awful lot of coal and firewood. What's that here for? That's more than you need for winter. So they go back, but it's all very theatrical. So I am, looking at it from an intelligence point of view, counterintelligence point of view, there's a lot of double agency going on here. There's a lot of people who know about it. Catesby himself, when he was challenged by one of the conspirators, Everard Digby, who said, look, hang on, we're going to blow up loads of our friends here. He said, don't worry, they're all going to be told about it. Right. So there's all sorts of things going on here that we don't see from the view of the modern period because the sources aren't there. And of course, the government's very keen to say, it's not all you Catholics. Yeah. It's a certain section of them. And I think the plot is very well engineered to this conclusion to enable that. That's very interesting. And Anna, it's quite compelling, isn't it? Particularly the sort of, the characters that are involved, the security around this area when you consider it, and also the legitimacy of the idea of the gunpowder being ruined.
Yeah, I would agree with all that's been said. Of course, we have to almost, peel back the layers of the narrative that was then established by the government, which was the narrative that they wanted, and that was what was published subsequently as the King's Book, and it was disseminated both at home and abroad. So I think it's absolutely right to think that there's lots of different people who are in the mix here. And it comes back to one of our sort of beginning points, that the plot is incredibly audacious. It's very easy with the sort of passage of history to kind of think, oh, yes, but it was, that would have just been not as sensational, as it's regarded today. It absolutely would have been. This was wiping out, executing the king, wiping out the ruling family and the ruling establishment and all those people in Parliament. So it was huge. It was a massive big deal. So it's really no wonder that various people are, getting cold feet, that different people are wanting this to kind of, to prove that this is what was going on, that they'd got the tip off right in order to get maximum impact from the arrest. So, yeah, I think there's a lot going on in this time, and in some sense, it's remarkable that it was managed to be timed in such a way that they did manage to catch Guy Fawkes red-handed. Especially given, those days when anything could have happened and any tip off back to Guy Fawkes himself that all wasn't well. So, yeah, pretty remarkable, but high stakes really, and I think that's what explains it. I think the other issue, Anna, is the fact that, of course, if you actually time it right up against the state opening of Parliament, you can go to Parliament very quickly with everybody there and say what has happened. So the propaganda version, which I think is on the 7th, Anna, as I remember, James goes to Parliament and says, look, this is what's happened. We've got this narrative. It's perfect because you've got everybody in town. Everybody's gathered. And so in these days before mass communication, you can actually get the word out into the counties very quickly. So there's something about this that isn't right. And you go back and you see all the sort of information warfare that takes place under Elizabeth. And this is what Robert Cecil inherits from his father and from Walsingham. And remember also, this is a fantastic opportunity to screw down the Catholics. And he particularly wants to screw down the Jesuits. There's an obsession for James and for Robert Cecil about Jesuits in particular. They're seen to be the stormtroopers of the Catholic Church, and they're the ones he's after.
So, of course, this was a plot hatched famously in London, but that had two components, another of which was here in the West Midlands, this map that we have in front of us. Anna, this is where Princess Elizabeth is at this time, and she has a very important role in this story.
That's right. Princess Elizabeth, James's daughter, his 9-year-old daughter at this point, she was under the care of Lord and Lady Harrington at Combe Abbey in the West Midlands. And the plan was essentially to kidnap her and use her as a sort of puppet queen, potentially. So when the plot is discovered and Guy Fawkes is arrested, the remaining plotters fled northwards. And on that day, or the day after, on the 6th of November, Robert Cecil gets word that from Lord Hamilton, that the stables at Warwick Castle had been broken into and some of the great horses had been taken. So from that, they gleaned that there was a potential rebellion brewing. Harrington moves Elizabeth to safety and keeps her away from potential harm. Whilst meanwhile, the plotters look to raise rebellion, believing that the Catholics would rise in support of them. They got as far as Holbeach House in Staffordshire, and there on the morning of the 8th, the Sheriff of Worcestershire, Richard Walsh, put the house under siege. And to cut the story short, there was a shootout, essentially. Catesby and Percy were killed. A number of other conspirators were injured, and those remaining ones were captured. So a damp squib, really, of a rising that eventually ended with a shootout. So again, plans for a rising, but essentially came to nothing.
I think it's interesting because it was quite well planned, to tell you the truth. They just didn't have the troops on the ground to have this rebellion. Initially, they've got a chap called Sir Everard Digby, who they recruited very late, actually, in October, both for his money and the fact that he himself is a swordsman. And they're in the Red Lion at Dunchurch, waiting to what is now the Red Lion at Dunchurch. And they're waiting to hear that the explosion has happened in London. In fact, Catesby arrives and actually says the King and Cecil are dead.
He said that?
Let's go for it.
Right.
Nobody believes them. And as Anna said, they've already raided Warwick Castle, so the word is out on them. And when they try and raise the West Midlands, everybody says, we're not moving. And what Cecil does is very clever. He actually sends out writs which say, these are traitors. And the word traitor actually puts people off from following these people. And indeed, some of the servants of Everard Digby say, well, what's going to happen to us? We thought we were just coming for a hunting trip, and now we're involved in treason, and they desert as well. And there's quite a farcical element that happens at Holbeach House. They decide to hold out, and they've got gunpowder with them, which is damp because it's been raining all day. And they think they're going to need that. And here's an interesting thing. Catesby actually says, look, we'll set up some booby traps here. And what they do is spread out the gunpowder in front of a fire. I mean, who would do that? And a spark actually ignites, and 4 of the conspirators get badly burnt as part of this before they get assaulted by the Sheriff of Worcestershire, and everybody is arrested. Everard Digby himself tries to escape and is captured pretty quickly. But the whole country just refuses to rise at that point. That's even before the word has come out, really, whether the thing has been successful or not.
Yeah, wow. It sounds just like a bit sort of chaotic, Anna, in lots of ways.
Yeah, I mean, it was chaotic. And I mean, people are, we have to be careful that we don't just assume that Catholics are automatically going to, or those with Catholic sympathies are going to support this plot. And ultimately, the country didn't rise. There wasn't sufficient support. There wasn't sufficient manpower for this rebellion to properly ignite. And it goes back to the point that this was a band of terrorists. This was a sort of small band of extremists that didn't really have the wider support of the people at large. And it goes back to that sense that they were seeking to kill the king. And we know, from history, if we sort of fast forward through to the Civil War and the end of the Civil War when Charles I is executed, there was a sense of, oh my goodness, what have we done? And so the fact that, this was a plot that people, were there to potentially support was a big ask. So in some sense, it's not a surprise. There was a kind of naivety there, I think, along with the kind of audacious ambition of the plot.
I think also a lot of the Catholics would have been waiting for instruction from their priests and from the Jesuits amongst them. The Pope himself at the time was very equivocal about whether he was able to actually sanction this sort of murder. People would have thought this was very immoral. That's the other thing. A lot of monarchs in Europe at the time have been assassinated, but to take out the whole ruling elite is quite extraordinary. The other aspect of this, which I find extraordinary, is most of these conspirators have been involved in the Essex Rebellion at the end of Elizabeth's reign. And that went off, as we say in the military, half-cocked, as a pistol does. And yet they didn't learn the lessons from that. And I think Anna's point that this was also about revenge. Quite a lot of the interrogations afterwards reveal that Catesby was thinking about, the reason I'm doing this is what has happened to Catholics. I really resent it, and partly this is revenge for that.
Do you think this moment here then, where the sort of claim that the assassination had worked was made and it wasn't believed, and do you think that was a sort of a key linchpin in a bit of an unravelling of this moment?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think if you remove the elite, you're going to have all sorts of local feuds breaking out all over England, to tell the truth, just like at the start of the Civil War. People took advantage of that point. But this is a bit of a joke. I mean, it's set up as a hunting expedition. There aren't more than 50 people there, so that's not great. You've got a very fortified city here, Coventry. The authorities there would have taken charge for their own safety in that respect. Princess Elizabeth's gone. The one thing that stands out from this plot that intrigues me is there's also Prince Charles. He's actually not been catered for. There was the suggestion that Thomas Percy, who's the major conspirator, the person that actually leases the Undercroft for the gunpowder, he's a member of the King's bodyguard. He's a pensioner, a royal pensioner. So he's got access throughout the Palace of Whitehall. And they actually try and say, look, why don't we get hold of Charles as well? Right. And it's actually quite important that you actually get him, because even if you get Princess Elizabeth, the rest of the country are going to say, well, actually, we've got Prince Charles.
We've got another one. We're all right. Yeah,
and he's a man.
So, Anna, all 13 of the conspirators are killed or captured. How does that sort of set the tone for what comes next?
Well, I mean, essentially all eyes therefore turn to the interrogations that are going to take place in London, with inevitable outcomes, of course, that the men are found guilty of treason. And an example is to be made of them. And the most vivid and dramatic example, of course, at this point is them being hanged, and then their bodies being castrated, eviscerated, cut into pieces, and their heads put on spikes along London Bridge.
And they're still alive up to the moment of decapitation. That's the key point. They're only hung for a few seconds. They're not unconscious, and all this takes place in full view.
And that was intended very much as a warning to others, and also to sort of display ultimately the might of the state, that, you know, this was, well, as James then said when he addressed Parliament on the Saturday, that this was about the Roman Catholic, you know, it was personal resentments of embittered men. And, you know, he didn't want to imply that this was the plot won the support of all Catholics. And also, you know, he wanted to stress that it was just the treason of a few, that it was just the work of a few fanatics. And he was absolutely determined that he didn't want to tar with the same brush the wider Catholic community, both at home and abroad.
Right, OK. So that's the real history of what happened during the Gunpowder Plot of 1605. I've been looking forward to saying this bit. Now, let's undo all of that, because this is, of course, History Undone. OK, let's get into what we love doing here on History Undone and ask ourselves some really long-term questions. Had the Gunpowder Plot succeeded? Chris, let's start with what we mean by success here in London. What constitutes success here?
Well, if we look at what the conspirators themselves wanted, particularly Catesby, he just wanted revenge for all the things that had happened to Catholics. And he wanted to remove the royal family, the elite, the nobility that would be there, and also the MPs. This is a massive slice of British society at the top taken out. So that would have been success. Then followed by this rebellion, Catholics rising and creating a regime basically around this puppet monarch, Princess Elizabeth, who said afterwards, look, I'd much rather have been blown up with my father than actually be a king on this basis, a queen on this basis. And it's ironic, really, because she became Queen of Bohemia during the 30 Years' War because she was married to Frederick Elector Palatine. And she's the mother of Rupert of the Rhine, Prince Rupert, who comes along later. So they'd have wanted to raise rebellion, but there's nothing after that. They don't think about the consequences of what happens after they've perhaps raised rebellion in the West Midlands. They don't think about the way the establishment is going to come back very hard at them. Yeah. They also sort of thought about alternatives. They tried to get Thomas Percy to get access to Prince Charles, who's the obvious figurehead if this all falls apart. But there's also somebody else, Arbella Stewart, who is a cousin of James. She is a legitimate claimant to the throne. And you can see Protestant and particularly establishment interest actually centering in the same way it centred on Mary Tudor when Lady Jane Grey was put on the throne, around either one of those figures. And you can see, I think, a situation where the heirs of the nobility who've been killed are going to be pretty angry about what's gone on. And everything is very personal and familial in early modern Britain. So people will take this very personally. So I suspect that whatever they thought they were going to achieve, they didn't think beyond raising the rebellion in the West Midlands. There is absolutely no suggestion in the interrogations beyond putting Elizabeth on the throne that actually they would do anything else.
That's interesting. So Anna, do you sort of agree with that principle that I guess what comes next probably is sort of what in a sense what happened anyway, which was kind of chaos?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think it's unlikely that things would have been very different had the plot been successful. You know, we know, for example, that the leader of the English Jesuits, Henry Garnet, you know, had been actually horrified by the plot. He'd ordered the plotters to not go ahead with it. And I think that, you know, the idea of this successful mass murder at Westminster would have left many Catholics absolutely appalled by it. You know, they wouldn't have been, I think, in any sort of position to support the rebels. And so I think we would have just seen, you know, an absolute catastrophe, really, for the English Roman Catholic community. I think it's also not clear that the Catholic powers of Europe would have suddenly decided to support this new Catholic regime. They were very hostile to the idea of kings just being assassinated, as you might imagine. And when we see a few years later Henry IV in France assassinated, you know, there is a very outraged response. So I don't think we would have seen the support of Catholic powers in Europe. And so, you know, I think in many ways, yes, it wouldn't have been incredibly different. What we would have seen, of course, if Elizabeth perhaps had been queen and there hadn't been any children of any marriage that she made, Charles might have become king later. And in that sense, the course of history would perhaps have played out as it did, with Charles just becoming king a little bit later. So, I mean, the great what ifs of history, and you always imagine, you know, that something as audacious as the Gunpowder Plot would have had a very carefully worked out plan as what might come next. But I think it's absolutely true, there wasn't one. And really, the plot and the focus was assassinating the ruling establishment, and what came next was really not the main part of their planning.
We're a couple of decades away from the Civil War here, aren't we, Chris? Is there an argument to say that that something like the Civil War happens earlier into that sort of vacuum rushes this war?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, talking as we are now, let's just suggest they did set up a regime under Princess Elizabeth. The obvious thing to do is set up a counter regime under Prince Charles. Yeah. And there's one foreign interference that I think we should consider. Queen Anna, if she had been killed, okay, then there is an issue associated with who actually is the regent for these children. Well, the answer is that Anna probably wasn't going to be there. So you find Anna of Denmark, actually the regent, and the first telephone call she would make in the modern era is to her brother, Christian IV of Denmark, to say, actually, I need some help here to stabilise this regime. And we know that Denmark and James in particular are very close together. And subsequently, as Anna describes in her book very well, Christian IV arrives with 8 warships, including his flagship, the Three Crowns, into the Thames, and would have been in a position to project power in support of the dynasty, whatever survived afterwards. So even if you've got hold of Queen Elizabeth, where I think it could have changed is you've basically taken out most of the nobility who are going to play a part in the run-up to the Civil War. Their heirs will be in place, and there would have been a tremendous temptation if Charles had actually been the king, as he grew to maturity, to adopt the absolute ideas of what are going on the continent. And we know from James's views of monarchy that actually that absolutism could have prevailed and would have provoked a reaction later. But most of the personalities just wouldn't exist. And so Cromwell, of course, you know, he's not an MP yet. He's only 6 years old himself. He'd come into the scene, that's for sure. But we've got a whole different political dynamic. And we could have had a Stuart monarchy that was an absolute monarchy all the way through to the time of Louis XIV, in the same sense, because you've taken out the tranche of Puritans and also the tranche of what I would call parliamentarian thinkers that actually built the opposition to absolute monarchy ahead of the Civil War.
How interesting. What do you think of that, Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting and credible thesis. I mean, I think it's also, you know, true that, you know, it ultimately, of course, depends whether Elizabeth would have continued as the Queen, or indeed whether she would have been displaced by her brother Charles. But I think, you know, we can imagine that both of them would have had an absolutely abiding hatred of Catholicism, and would have, you know, absolutely doubled down on that. I think it's absolutely right that we have to remember the very powerful Protestant alliance that Anna of Denmark had brought with Christian of Denmark. And if Anna had continued to be a player, you know, that adds additional complexity to it. I mean, she's very much overlooked in the narrative, really. It's, you know, it's sort of assumed that she would be in Parliament, but I don't think that was a given. And, you know, it's another example, really, of how they sort of didn't get clear eyes on, or hands on, if you like, the key players. And if they hadn't got a kind of hands on Charles and Elizabeth and Anne, then, you know, there were so many variables that made, you know, their agenda even more difficult to see realised, if indeed, you know, they really had a credible agenda. And I think that's where it all becomes a bit unstuck.
A key sort of character who's about to emerge then is Oliver Cromwell. You know, somebody who will go on to be one of the most significant figures in our history, really. How does our version of events change his history?
Well, Darryl, as I said, I think the whole dynamic changes. If you do get a regency under Anna of Denmark, supported by her brother with either Charles or Elizabeth, you then get a situation where you get, I think, a very aggressive Protestantism in these islands. And so how does that play on the continent, for example? Because you get the 30 Years' War breaking out in 1618. Now, quite a lot of Protestants, both from Scotland and from England, have fought in that war. So you've got an interesting dynamic here where quite a lot of these people are going abroad. As Anna says, Charles is not going to be really conducive to being tolerant to Catholics. Would he marry a Catholic princess from France as he did? I doubt if he would. So all the reasons for rebelling in 1642 start to disappear. And I think, you know, just like his father, Charles would have veered towards a more Presbyterian form of church government. He wouldn't be the Laudian sort of champion that he became. And so almost every aspect changes. I mean, I think that the key issue is if you remove the nobility, you've got all sorts of dynastic issues going on in every county of England and indeed Scotland, because there's quite a lot of Scots going to be at this Parliament as well. So how does that play out? So the power structures within counties are changing. So again, if that is aggressive Protestantism again, all the disputes over religion, over jurisdiction start to disappear. So the reasons for Oliver Cromwell, indeed all the parliamentarian lobbies appearing, just disappear because you are that nation already. So we're almost saying that the nation of 1689 appears earlier, and you get a Protestant monarchy, probably more absolute than you would want. And if there is any opposition, it is to that absolute monarchy.
Right, well, that's so interesting. And so, Anna, to what you write about in your book, I suppose, in our version of history, I mean, you talk about global Britain and the British Empire. How does our version of history here influence that?
Well, I mean, James didn't want to really commit to aggressive Protestant policy abroad, in part because England simply couldn't afford it. And so, instead he relied on trade and promoting trade and exporting the idea of Britain abroad to bring in customs revenues. But I mean, as has been said, I mean, his policy, he wanted to position himself as the great peacemaker. It wound up a lot of Protestants at home because, of course, as been said, the 30 Years' War was kicking off on the continent. And James was seen as not taking a lead. So I think that it would, have consolidated the idea of Britain as a key Protestant player on the continent, as opposed to being one that was looked to, but actually didn't deliver. I mean, James, it was often said of James, that he promised much, but didn't really deliver a lot. I don't think beyond that necessarily the course of British expansion would particularly be different in terms of trade, because so much of the impetus for expansion at this period was done through merchants, through businessmen, through the guilds in London, and I think that sort of economic imperative was absolutely there, and it had been because of the war with Spain in the 16th century. So from that point of view, I don't think it would have changed. I mean, if we think about a country, though, that was much more Protestant, we might not have seen, for example, the exodus on the Mayflower of Puritans who felt that, they couldn't be at home in England. So in that sense, the export of the Puritans, the Mayflower, Plymouth Colony and all of that may well have been different.
I think there are two aspects of that. Just to reinforce what Anna says, I think that aggressive Protestantism would have looked back to the Elizabethan era and said, actually, we need more warships. And we know under Charles, of course, there's a great expansion of the Royal Navy. The ship money issue is associated with that. So I think that aggression would have been expressed at sea. So that's the first thing. You'd have seen the rise of what became the Royal Navy, certainly, and in tandem with increasing trade around the world, you need to protect it. So you need the warships to do that against pirates and other hostile powers. There's one other aspect that we need to consider is, of course, Ireland to the west. If you've got a more aggressive Protestantism in England and Scotland, you've got a massive Catholic population here that is looking across and saying, crikey, this is not going to be great for us. And so there's going to be an early, I think, awakening of Irish sort of culture and also language and everything else. So some of the things that we saw later appearing in, towards the end of the 18th and 19th century, I think probably occur much earlier. There is one other aspect as well, depending on the state of anarchy in England itself, what's happening in Scotland? Is Scotland saying, well, actually, we don't want to be part of this. They don't have any figure to displace the Stuarts in terms of legitimacy or anything like that. But I just wonder if Scotland gets a bit more disordered as a result of a Gunpowder Plot that succeeds. Quite a lot of Scottish nobles are down for this Parliament and also looking to benefit from, obviously, James being in power.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Anna, let's imagine the idea of an absolute monarchy works and persists. I mean, how long do we carry that course?
mean, it's very hard because so many things are sort of contingent, so it's hard to believe, quite what may or may not be different. But I think we would see potentially, a Protestant absolute monarchy, like Sweden, like Denmark, through the 17th and 18th century. I mean, you could say that, all that came next may not have come next, as it were, if we think about, all that comes with the Glorious Revolution and the Bill of Rights and so on. So I think we'd be on a very different path. And so much of history is, about sort of contingents, certain things happening leading to something else. And of course, it very much depends whether it's Elizabeth and Elizabeth's line of succession, or in fact, Charles, is installed and then ends up marrying Henrietta Maria that he does. So I guess it's at what point you stop the counterfactual and believe that, Charles inherited the throne and was married to Henrietta Maria. So some things would then be different, but some things wouldn't.
There's one thing that I think comes out of this is if the plot is successful, blowing people up is suddenly become very trendy. And I just wonder, how many other assassinations and things, instead of the defenestration of Prague in 1618, actually that was a gunpowder issue. And, as with modern terrorism, people tend to copy each other. So this might have become a popular form of getting rid of regimes. So how does that change across Europe? The whole dynamic of feudalism coming into early modern sort of structures and things like that. And certainly if you have something of this scale, other people are going to want to copy it.
Okay, so we have remembered the 5th of November. And I guess what we've learnt is that the conspirators didn't do what we are doing right now, which is plotting out what might have come next, and therefore, presumably, a vacuum, chaos, which I guess would have given way to maybe a different political, religious dynamic, but ultimately, we probably would have ended up where we ended up anyway. How fascinating, how interesting. Well, that's what we've got time for on History Undone today. Thank you to Professor Anna Whitelock and Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry for joining me. We'll be back undoing history some more very soon. In the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Times Radio History on YouTube. You then won't miss anything, and you can listen to History Undone wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, goodbye.